So here we are with a new Prime Minister in place 2 years on from the general election. In my last podcast, we had 2 expert guests join us to explore what an Andy Burnham premiership could mean for schools in England. In this episode, I have brought together 2 policy experts to help us take a look at what could happen in post-16 education, consisting of universities, colleges, apprenticeship providers and many other organisations. So, will universities be top or bottom of the priority list for Andy Burnham and his new team of ministers? What might devolution and Manchesterism mean for colleges and other education providers across the country? And are the recent debates over student loans and cuts to apprenticeship funding likely to continue or fade away under this new administration? My guests are Julian Gravatt, OBE, Deputy Chief Executive at the Association of Colleges, and Professor Diana Beech, Director of the Finsbury Institute at City St George's, part of the University of London. I'm Tom Richmond, and to find out if major reforms could be on the way to post-16 education in England, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Just like with my previous podcast on what Andy Burnham in No.10 might mean for schools, let's begin our conversation by looking for clues in Andy Burnham's political career thus far in terms of what he might want to do in the education system after age 16. Julian, if we look at the earlier stages of his political career, what have we seen Andy Burnham talking about in terms of post-16 education?
Andy Burnham was Shadow Education Secretary for about 1.5 years, and I was doing exactly the same job then as I'm doing now, and he was very active. He was campaigning on financial support for students because the government had recently closed the education maintenance allowances, and I remember him making a speech about how the qualifications for EBAC wasn't right and there needed to be different routes for students. He made that to a conference of sixth form college principals. And so I think he's carried on those 2 particular themes, which is, financial support. His bus campaign has made a big difference for people to travel to college and school. And also he's pushed for sort of MBAC, which is a sort of wrapper for qualifications. So in 2 areas of education, he's continued to pay quite an interest.
What about his thoughts on devolution in terms of education? He was Mayor of Manchester for obviously many, many years. Did that have any effect, you think, on education?
Yeah, and it's a very constrained kind of setup that the mayors are responsible for an adult skills budget that has been cut by 30% in real terms over the period of which he's in charge of it. But the Greater Manchester Combined Authority has always tried to use its powers and its budgets actively. It's listened to college principals about the fact that the rates had to go up slightly to deal with inflation. There's been work to try and get the colleges to collaborate and to specialise in certain areas. Colleges more recently have been working on an innovation project which has had innovators and residents in each of the college to try and work with small companies. So there's definitely foundations to build on in that area of activity. And he's also campaigned for wider devolution, and I guess that'll be an interesting thing to see how this goes in the future landscape.
OK, thank you. So that's a bit about the past. Diana, what about the present? After becoming an MP in June, Andy Burnham has given quite a few speeches which have started to sketch out some of his high-level policy thinking. So what have you seen and heard about his views on post-16 education?
Yeah, you're right, Tom. He has been speaking about it, and tertiary education even made it into his first speech shortly after announcing his Labour leadership bid in Manchester. I think Burnham's central message is that the UK needs to stop treating university as the default destination for every young person. He has repeatedly argued that the education system has been too heavily configured around the university route, And I've heard him say this myself, ironically, at the Conservative Party conference, which was held in Manchester a few years ago. And he was doing his rounds on the fringe events. And he was saying then that technical and vocational pathways should enjoy genuine parity of esteem. So he's a huge advocate for the whole tertiary system and equality within it. So I do think in that respect, universities are at risk of losing their place, as the only place in town or at the top of that post-16 education tree, if you like. But at the same time, Burnham has been careful not to overly offend the higher education sector too much, because he has stressed that universities remain critical institutions for innovation, for regional growth and for placemaking. So all is not lost for universities in Burnham's vision for Britain, don't worry. He clearly sees a big role for them in terms of economic leadership, but he'd also clearly like to reduce their dominance within the education and skills system. So it's all a bit carrot and stick, really, I think.
These do seem to be some quite contrasting perspectives here. On the one hand, we've got universities in Manchester, which are generally regarded as being a success story over the past 10 years or so. And Andy Burnham's talked recently about, quote, placing universities at the heart of local economies. But on the other hand, as you were saying, and as we were talking about in my previous podcast, he's also talking about the days of a school system configured entirely around the university route will be brought to an end. So, Diana, how would you try to square this policy circle? How easy would it be to both emphasise and de-emphasise universities?
Yeah, OK, I'm going to take that in parts. I mean, first and foremost, I'm going to put it out there that I don't think Burnham is necessarily anti-university. I mean, look, he benefited from a University of Cambridge higher education himself. So he's done pretty well out of it. And it'd look pretty bad if he pulled up that drawbridge for others. But I think what he is anti-conventional, anti-hierarchy. He clearly sees the benefits that universities bring to his patch in Manchester, so I don't think he wants to undermine that in any way. But what he also sees is those people that don't get to reap the benefits from higher education, whether directly or indirectly. And he also sees those that have been failed by the system. So yes, I think he'll be first to acknowledge that universities bring advantages to certain individuals, but he also will be the first to acknowledge that university isn't for everyone. So what I think we can expect him to do is to focus on a broadening out of the routes into good careers and into good future outcomes, whether that's through a degree, whether it's through an apprenticeship, or whether it's through other forms of technical education. I personally hope that doesn't mean a doing down of universities under his reign. I think it will just mean an evaluation of other options or elevation of other options through further education colleges and through local training providers. I mean, I really hope that Burnham doesn't want fewer universities. I think he just wants fewer dead ends for people who don't go to university. And if I'm going to be controversial about it, I think he wants fewer dead ends for those that do go to university, but then find they can't secure a job at the end of it. Hence his recent remarks that universities aren't for everyone.
Julian, what's your take on these apparently divergent views on the role of universities in post-16 education?
The higher education route works for some, but it's proving quite expensive, and sometimes it's not quite getting people the outcomes they want, and they're leaving with quite a big debt. And there's a large number of people who don't go to higher education at all. So it's trying to get some kind of balance. And I suppose the vehicle through which some of the policy on this may become clearer is through the Milburn Review, where the interim report was pretty critical of the way in which the education system currently works and has a pretty cold shower for us all in terms of how difficult it is for young people to get jobs and to get stable careers. But what's very unclear, and we may find out in September, is what the final recommendations from the Milburn report are and what then the new government, and it won't just be the Prime Minister, it'll be the Chancellor, Education Secretary and other ministers do in response.
Perhaps one way for universities to remain central to local economies and boosting this non-university provision would be through more collaboration between HE and FE, with potentially more partnerships, more pathways, as Diana was saying, sort of opening up more routes to the same outcome. The 2024 Labour manifesto promised more collaboration, but we haven't really seen any decisive shifts towards new delivery models in the post-16 space, even though Manchester seems to have ploughed its own path in this area. Julian, do you think more collaboration between institutions is perhaps the right way to try and realise Andy Burnham's vision here? And are there even the levers in place to pursue that agenda if he wanted to?
Yeah, and I think we've had a system which is over decades has emphasised competition and judged institutions individually. And so it's a sort of healthy sign that there's collaborative efforts in places like Manchester, Durham, South Yorkshire and Exeter between colleges and universities. And we've worked with my organisation, Association of Colleges, to work with Universities UK to sort of try and examine what works in those models, but also have listed quite a few areas where regulation and legal differences and other sort of details make it difficult for collaboration to happen. So having had decades of policy being driven by competition and judging institutions individually, I think it's a very big shift to then create some of those things. And so this government's only 2 years in since its manifesto. So you're right, it's only made small steps, but it'd be interesting to see if they continue on this journey.
Diana, from an HE perspective, what's your sense of where this collaboration agenda may go next? Is it something that universities should be welcoming, perhaps a bit more pressure from the centre of government on more collaboration with FE, or is that something they should potentially fear?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, from the university perspective, I have to say I know quite a few universities in the country, not least Manchester, that are already developing these pathways with their, colleges, technical neighbours, technical education neighbours, and then different types of universities within the region as well. And developing this kind of hop-on, hop-off approach between the institutions. So I think there's something in there. But of course, remember, they've had the will of Burnham as mayor. That doesn't happen everywhere. So I think if universities are going to be waiting for a bit of a top-down push from government, then I've got to be a bit of a Grinch and say I think they might be waiting for a long time. That's because of the parliamentary process. We can set aside the actual merits of the policy intent at the moment, but look at the reality of the situation that Burnham is going to inherit. He's only going to be in office for a maximum of 3 years. That's when the parliamentary term ends. And that is assuming, of course, that he makes it that far. Because given the recent tenure of prime ministers in this country, I think we've learnt that we can't assume anything. So he doesn't really have that long to get things done. And within that time, he's going to want to deliver those priorities and those things that will get him elected and his party at the next general election. I think we've got to face facts that universities are not going to be at the top of the list, despite what he's saying now. Universities might be a priority when he's mayor, but when he's prime minister, he's got these big global issues and issues of national sovereignty to deal with, not least the economic growth in this country, NHS reform, security and defence issues. So universities are going to take a little bit of a back seat, irrespective of what he's saying at the moment. And then, of course, even if he does mandate more collaboration at the top, you've got the big clunky civil service process to get through. There's usually a right-round process within government where the Department for Education, in this case, probably will be writing to the other departments to see what they think about it. They'll be writing to the sector through a consultation process and allow them time for responses. None of this is quick. So I think time really will be limited for any policy delivery. So that's a long way of saying that if universities want more collaboration, they've got to get on and do it themselves, because I don't think they're going to get that push from the top of government.
Well, one area where we have certainly seen a big push from government recently is around apprenticeships, because over the course of this year, the government has already made several hugely significant changes to apprenticeships in an effort to direct more funding towards young people, which we discussed in an entire episode on this topic back in May. Most obviously, there was the decision to scrap many apprenticeships that were typically aimed at older and more experienced workers. Diana, many universities have been very unhappy at some of the changes that we've seen to apprenticeships, especially the decision to restrict level 7, that's master's degree level apprenticeships, to those aged 21 and under. So how should universities and colleges and other post-16 providers think about what's likely to come next? Has the government pushed as far as they can, or should they be thinking that there's more coming down the line?
Yeah, and I should declare an interest here because I am a recent graduate of a level 7 degree apprenticeship, having graduated just in January this year. When I started that, I ran a small company, a small charitable business. So it was a great way for me to access the skills that I needed as a first-time CEO, as I was at the time. But also I looked around my cohort. I'd say a good 3/4 of them were from public service professions, many from the NHS. This is an organisation that the government has committed to prioritise, to reform, and these are the leaders of tomorrow. And if they're not getting the skills that they need, you've got to ask a question, well, where else are they going to get them from? So I think universities are still going to try and deliver in this space, probably not at level 7. They're probably going to have to drop the levels in the technical terms, level 6, level 5. Those qualifications are still valuable. But I do think that universities are going to have to, again, face facts that I think this trend will continue. Julian's just mentioned the Milburn Review. This government is concerned about the high proportion of young people who are NEETs, not in education, employment or training. And I think this is what is pushing the government to invest earlier in people's lives. And to do that, there's not much money sloshing around in the pot. They've got to rob Peter to pay Paul. And I think this is the trade-off. They are taking the money from the older, more mature learners, whatever you like to call them, and putting it into the start of that pipeline. And I think certainly under this Labour government so far, under the Starmer government, we have seen the apprenticeship system increasingly being mobilised, not as a workforce policy, as I think it started out, but as a youth opportunity policy. So I think that is where we're heading, and I think universities will lose their share of the pie when it comes to the apprenticeship money, unfortunately.
Julian, what do you think we'll see in the apprenticeship system with Andy Burnham in charge? Are there more changes on the way? You've already mentioned, as Diana has, the Milburn Review over at the Department for Work and Pensions, which looks like it's very, very much focused on getting young people into work. So do you think the apprenticeship system is likely to see more changes, or have we seen so many big changes recently, it will probably be the status quo for now?
I think it's likely that the Milburn Review might bring further change. Diana's right that there's a limited pot of money and there's only so many choices. And what happened in the last 8 years is that as higher level apprenticeships and apprenticeships for those who are already in work grew, apprenticeships for younger people reduced. So the Skills Minister wrote a letter a couple of weeks ago in which she said that she wanted to see, I think it's 50,000 more apprenticeship starts among people under 25, and you could see that being adopted by the Milburn Review. And she also asked for a look at the funding levels for the 10 most popular apprenticeships taken by younger people. And again, you could see those action on that being one of the issues in the autumn, but both of those things would involve an increasing amount of spending going on younger adults and on the programmes they take, and that will only come effectively from one place in the current fiscal environment.
So this seems to raise another interesting policy tension, potentially as we move forward, which is around who gets to control where the money goes, because we know that Andy Burnham is a huge fan of devolution, as you were saying, Julian, right across his whole policy agenda, not just in education. But at the moment, we have a hugely centralised apprenticeship system. And despite Andy Burnham's best efforts as Mayor of Manchester to get his hands on apprenticeship funding directly, the government resisted for many, many years. So now we have a situation where someone is going to be in charge who wants more devolution, but we have a fully nationalised apprenticeship system, which will not necessarily be very easy to break open and devolve any of it. So, Julian, what are you expecting in this space? Are mayors going to get their hands on more, not just apprenticeship funding, but maybe FE and HE funding too? Or is that going to be too complicated with only 3 years left of this parliament, as Diana was saying?
There are definitely options in this. Remember that the apprenticeship levy is a UK-wide tax, so about 1 in 7 of the pounds goes to Scotland and Wales, and they then spend it as they wish outside the sort of core apprenticeship system. And there's different views about how successful that is, and so you could see some kind of top slicing happening on that, and perhaps going to some of the mayoral combined authorities. But as we get towards 35 combined authorities, it starts to create quite a lot of challenges in that space. And then on the 16 to 18 budget, which is much bigger, it's not just Andy Burnham, there's mayors of East Midlands, Yorkshire, North East have all pushed for control of the 16 to 18 budget, and it could happen. I have to say my view is that it's a very big and complicated reform, and you can't just extract skills or colleges easily out of a 16 to 18 system where young people make choices quite quickly in year 11 and then sometimes change their minds. And so would they be crossing between different systems? We've done quite a big paper on this, setting out things, and just picking up on Diana's earlier point, this wouldn't be a straightforward change because it would require legal changes and budget changes and all the rest. And so you could announce it quite quickly, but you might not be implementing it until 2029, 2030. So perhaps another way through this devolution thing would be, there's a word that got banned in government for a while, to pilot it in some areas, maybe areas with slightly more coherent systems. But let's see.
Diana, in the HE space, I don't hear the word devolution talked about much in the same way that we've had a very much a live debate over, say, apprenticeships and the adult skills budget and FE, etc. So where do you think devolution fits into the thinking of HE leaders at the moment? Should they be running towards this agenda, or should they be perhaps just sitting and waiting to see how it plays out?
The HE sector does a lot of sitting and waiting, and it can't afford to do that anymore. So I think it's got to embrace this one. As Julian said, Burnham's entire political philosophy is built around the idea of devolution and that place matters. So although we might be speculating about most things, we do know that. So it's not going to go away. So I think we've got to get on it. Again, though, I do think we need to face facts that, not all universities operate in devolved areas or areas of mayoral authority. So those that do so, they've got a head start. Manchester, West Midlands, London, where I am, we're all used to talking as a collective and a collaborative in our regional groups. But what happens if you are, in Devon, in Cornwall, in my home county of Hereford, Worcester? Who do you talk to? Who are you going to call? So that's a lot harder. It's not saying that you can't start from that bottom-up initiative and kind of form a collaboration or a regional grouping, but you're not going to have any mayoral control, so probably what's the point? And quite frankly, universities have got a lot of things to be dealing with at the moment, not least their finances. So there are other things to be doing. I do think, though, that universities should be showing some goodwill and working closely with their local leaders and mayoral authorities. We have the LSIPs, the Local Skills Improvement Plans, which are a legacy from the Boris Johnson government. They are there. They're waiting to be delivered. These are 29 regional plans in England showing how universities will deliver on the skills agenda in their local places based on the ethos that skills needs are very different across the country. Skills shortages in Manchester are not the same as skills shortages in Camden, and we know that. So actually they can get on and start delivering on those LSIPs. Don't leave them sitting on the shelf. And actually that could be a way forward to show some goodwill and to get this moving.
Okay, a quick word now on tuition fees, because if Andy Burnham's previous comments are anything to go by, then we could be in for some rather big changes on this enormously high-profile topic. Julian mentioned at the beginning that Andy Burnham was Shadow Education Secretary in the early 2010s, and at that time he was very critical of tuition fees rising to £9,000, as Julian was saying, because he was placing such a strong emphasis on financial support for students, and indeed his concerns around how £9,000 could affect students from poorer backgrounds. And then in 2015, during a Labour leadership contest, he called for a graduate tax, saying, quote, "No young person should have to start their career weighed down by a millstone of debt. Labour will lift it off them." Diana, fees and loans are very high on the political and media radar at the moment. But as Chancellor, Rachel Reeves said that reforming HE funding was basically at the back of the queue, as you mentioned earlier. So how can Andy Burnham avoid being drawn into debates over fees and loans when it's such a high-profile topic at the moment, and perhaps given some of his previous comments too?
Do you know what? I don't think he should avoid it. If he wants to take the biggest political office or the highest political office in this country, then he cannot shirk the big questions. He has to front them up. And he has spoken on this in the past, so he should be challenged about how he's going to tackle it. What I would say, however, is those comments were made in a past life. They were made before, these tuition fee increases were the very things that made the universities in his patch of Manchester as successful as they are now. Those higher fees enabled them to do the high quality research through cross subsidies. It enabled them to do the business effort to attract international students. It is what has made them stronger. So anything that will undermine that, particularly right now when university finances are under strain, that could really lead to sort of instability in the sector. And he wouldn't want to be seen to preside over the collapse of England's first university title institution. So I think even if Burnham does just want to focus on let's say, the soft stuff of skills, of devolution, of technical education, higher education funding has a habit of forcing its way onto the agenda right now. So he cannot avoid it. He does need to tackle it. And I think that has been one of the biggest letdowns for the higher education sector of the Starmer government. All hopes were on this white paper. Quite frankly, it was quite a damp squib. No one's delivering on anything. It didn't really tell us anything new. So I suppose he's got a chance, not that we want another review, but I think we're going to have another review to look at the whole thing again. But then it goes back to what I said before. There's not much time to implement it. So I think he's got to just pick something quickly and to make a quick win. And I'm not sure what that is, or else maybe I'd be in his job.
Well, in terms of things that are happening soon, Diana, the international student levy is still in motion and is still set to arrive in the not too distant future. We know that obviously the different universities in Manchester have attracted a lot of international students in recent years. Do you see this as something universities should be focusing on in terms of their lobbying efforts, or actually should they be keeping their heads down and just making sure it comes into place effectively in the not too distant future?
Yeah, it's one of those things of moving with the times again. I know Burnham is on record as having sent a letter to the government to say that, international student levy is a bad thing. But yeah, again, he could do that as mayor. It's very different when you're Prime Minister and you're looking at getting more money to fund other initiatives. And, it is a very new Labour principle to take from international students to put into the domestic opportunity pot, if you like. So it would fit his narrative, and it is a way of giving students more maintenance support that they need, particularly those from the most disadvantaged communities. So I think universities can try and lobby. I think they should lobby, because any chipping away of university finances right now from left, right and centre is making an impact. So if you can do some damage limitation on one part, that would be quite helpful. But I don't think, I stand to be corrected, but I don't think it will be something that Burnham will easily U-turn on, because there's a lot of money going to come into the Treasury from it.
Julian, do you think we are heading for some major reforms, or perhaps, as Diana was saying, a major review of fees and loans, given the growing clamour for change? Of course, colleges are affected by this as well as universities too.
I mean, there's a lot of pressure on for reforms, but the difficulty, I guess, is that there's two different of interest groups. I mean, there's those who work in higher education and their staff who are rightly worried about the financial squeeze, but at the same time, there's those who've graduated, and so the recent Treasury Committee report who identified the fact there's issues about the repayments. And the thing is, in order to address the second group, you're not necessarily going to do much to deal with the first group, and anything the government does in terms of ameliorating the system will get scored in the sort of fiscal figures as being a sort of negative, because the last government made all these changes to make sure that graduates paid for the higher education system. So perhaps a big review, which you can persuade the markets, you do one big write-off and then you sort of start afresh, might be possible. But yeah, I fear there might just be drift again.
Yes, we've certainly had plenty of that over the past 5 or 10 years on the issue of student loans. OK, we are almost at the end of this episode, so it's time for my last question for today. Since the 2024 election, it's been a bit of a strange mix of dramatic changes in some post-16 areas like apprenticeships, alongside very little changes in spaces like HE and FE, apart from perhaps tuition fees creeping upwards with inflation. So regardless of the recent post-16 white paper, which, as you were saying, Diana, wasn't exactly a blockbuster document, it still feels as though there is a lot of room here for some new and potentially radical thinking in this space. So my question is, what advice would you give Andy Burnham about how he should approach post-16 education over the rest of this Parliament? Julian, what would be your message to Andy Burnham about this crucial policy area?
I think I'll understand what it is that has actually been done in terms of, there's quite a big 16 to 18 qualification reform, which has a potential to get us a better system by 2030. And so think through whether you want to make any marginal changes, or your education secretary does. The Milburn Review is an obvious thing for September, and that both needs to be action taken on it and will need to be some funding to tackle the big problem of needs. And then more generally, I think it's continued down a kind of approach that emphasises collaboration and also pilots changes, while perhaps if you've got some big reforms, I guess that's going to have to, some of them are going to have to be implemented by the time of the second term, if there is one.
Thank you, Julian. Diana, what words of wisdom would you offer Andy Burnham about post-16 education?
Oh, words of wisdom. I probably sound a little bit of a broken record in this one for those who know me, but my main bit of advice would be, we have a world-leading higher education sector here in the UK, but we've been complacent about it. And that has been reflected in the machinery of government and the way that universities are handled within government. So please bring back a dedicated universities minister to rejoin the science, research and education parts of the brief so they can see things in the whole, and reduce that fragmentation in government policy making. And ideally put that minister in a business department, because universities effectively are those big businesses that do the international education exports, that bring in money through commercialisation. And again, that's currently being left out when we sort of just put them in that tertiary box. And if I can have just another bit of cheeky advice, I have to say this as former CEO of London Higher and working for a London institution at the moment, City St George's. Please refrain from any London bashing when you devise policy and any crude north-south debates and political point scoring. Because the reality is that the streets are not all made of gold in London. Not everything is better here. London boroughs have some of the highest rates of deprivation, student disadvantage, and I think that needs to be taken seriously.
Thank you, Diana. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Diana and Julian for giving us their perspectives on how post-16 education could evolve during Andy Burnham's time in No.10. Inside Your Ed is now heading off for its regular summer break, so please do use the next few weeks to catch up on any episodes that you missed by visiting insideyoured.com. And if you're new to this podcast, then don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me at the start of the new academic year when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.